Okay, well, thank you very much for attending this evening's program about streets and their names. Torrington's roadways are closely connected with the development of the city. So tonight, as we explore stories about some streets, we will also learn about factors that led to Torrington's growth from a small agricultural community in the 18th century to a city of approximately 35,000 people, the largest in Litchfield County. On a daily basis, we pass local street signs, but how often do we actually think about the names these signs may hold and the hidden histories behind them? That might be something just historical society people do. I don't know. Some streets reference long gone families, historic sites, and landmarks. Others reference industries or the city's rich ethnic history, while others followed trends of naming streets after trees, flowers, waterways, and in other cases, after noted figures or events in American history. In the 1730s, Ebenezer Lyman and his family became the first white settlers in this town. And 18th century settlers like the Lymans were in search of good farmland. And in Torrington, the best agricultural lands were located on the western and eastern hills of town. So of course you can see that from this map that Lyman's house was located on what is now, Clug Hill Road. And the east side of town was the area that we today know as Torringford. The river valley down here and what's now downtown Torrington was a swamp. So this was not an area for early settlement. The Lyman home was located on Clug Hill Road, but before the Lyman family came to Torrington in the early 20th century and established their farm there, this road was long known as Lyman Street. And similarly, Highland Avenue, the site of the John Cook homestead, was known as Cook Street for many, many decades. 1740, John Cook was named the first town clerk, and he held that position for nearly 40 years. His home on Highland Avenue was the site of most town business at that time, hence the name Cook Street. This view of the Goshen Road shows you a very rural west part of town, and the Goshen Road in 1803 was designated as the Goshen-Sharon Turnpike. Many early roads reference directions or destinations they led to, so it's no surprise that this is known as the Goshen Road. As I said, the Clug Hill Road was earlier known as Lyman Street, and this area still remains the agricultural area that it once was. Highland Avenue that you see here, this is a view of it in 1869. We have another early view from the 1890s, and interestingly, in both cases, an inscription on the back of each photo identifies it, or identifies each one as Heightland Avenue, which certainly makes me wonder about the name and if it may have ever been called that. The West End has many roads that still contain historic names or reference historic sites. And among them are Town Farm Road, which was the site of a working town farm that housed and fed the poor people for many, many years. And Hodges Hill Road, of course, referenced an early family, but you'll also see Ice House Road, Ice House Road, Brass Mill Dam Road. And at the top of this image, you'll see Brandy Hill Road. And there are many stories that talk about the naming of Brandy Hill Road. It was named in the 1790s. One states that it was the location of at least one brandy still, while another talks about a jug of brandy being dropped from the rooftop of a house that was under construction. Whatever the story, it certainly makes for an interesting street name in Torrington. Many other streets are named after early families, and Newberry Place, which is located between Litchfield Street and New Litchfield Road, is one such street in Torrington. The Newberrys were a very early family in this area. Torringford Street was settled first in the 1740s, in 1744, and it became quite an established community within 20 years, so much so that the people of what was then called East Torrington petitioned to establish their own church, their own ecclesiastical society. And as you can imagine, in the 18th century, the trek from East Torrington to the western side of town, where that one church was located every week, would have been quite a journey. Fortunately for them, they successfully petitioned and they were granted the right to establish a church. And what had also happened at the same time was that New Hartford was very interested, or the New Hartford residents living in that proximity, right near the Torrington-New Hartford line, were interested in becoming part of this church. And so when the church was established, the name Torringford was selected, that being a combination of the names Torrington and New Hartford. And of course, the street as we know it today is Torringford Street, as is the area. Again, names of many early families exist throughout the east and west sides of town, those two early areas that were established. And they include Ivane, Hodges, Dibble, Battelle, Gaylord, Duran, Griswold, Hayden. There are many, many references to these early families. The road that you see connecting, here we go, what's now the north end, basically connecting the east and west sides, is known to us as Winthrop Street. I'm having a heck of a time with this arrow. Here we go. This is known as Winthrop Street, and of course Charles Street. But early on, this was referred to as the Old Torringford Road. And the Old Torringford Road, of course, led to Torringford, hence the name. There was a family that long occupied a home on what's now Charles Street, the Cook home, and that house still exists. And so in the late 1890s, it was decided to name Winthrop Street after Winthrop Cook. This is the Cook house as it was at that time period. And Charles Street was named after Charles Cook. What we begin to find, though, by the early part of the 19th century is that the downtown area is suddenly becoming a central place for settlement and for business. And there were several factors that played into this. The north-south road that we today know as Main Street was established in the 18th century, as was Water Street. And then we see several turnpikes coming into town, the Torrington-Litchfield Turnpike, the Goshen-Sharon Turnpike, the Waterbury River Turnpike, the Wolcottville Turnpike, and of course in 1849, the railroad. And what happens is that this now becomes a center in large part because an early industry, the woolen mill, was established in the center of town in the early 19th century, followed by a brass mill. And they were taking advantage, of course, of that incredible water power that the branches of the Naugatuck River provided, especially along Water Street. And what you find by the time you see this, as we're looking at this 1859 map, what you find is that there are pockets of settlement throughout the town, but it would become Wolcottville down at the bottom, the center of town, that would become the biggest area of growth. And that would make it also the area where the most streets would be located. This is a photo of the Union Manufacturing Company, an early industry that used the water power along the river. Co-Brass, Turner, Seymour, and Judd would later become Turner and Seymour Company. And I don't think I need to tell you how Water Street earned its name. This is a view looking downriver with the industries situated along the river, and you can see the buildings of Water Street on the far left. Obviously, the street was named after that feature. So by the middle of the 19th century, and certainly progressing into the 20th century, downtown Torrington is a hub of activity. This early image of Main and Water Street shows you a road or a downtown area with, of course, dirt roads, but you can see that buildings and businesses have been established, and this is really becoming a vital source of population as well. People are coming down from the hills and the towns around Torrington looking for jobs, because now this area was offering jobs in the factories. As I said earlier, many streets were named after the towns they led to. And this is the case with Litchfield Street, pictured here. Litchfield Street, as you can see in this photo, the library is their newly constructed library is pictured here. And on the left is the Co House, now the site of Co Park. New Litchfield Street was previously known as the Old Litchfield Road, and it was renamed in later years to New Litchfield Street, although I'm not sure how much that clarifies anything. It's kind of funny. Many other streets indicate direction, as with East Main Street. And also this view of East Main Street looking toward the center of town, showing the center bridge with shops on the bridge, as was the case for many, many decades before the 1955 flood. South Main Street was previously known, and when I say previously, the earliest maps show it as South Street in the 1850s, and then it was named Plymouth Street. It led to Plymouth, and it held that name for quite a long time before finally being renamed South Main Street. And by the way, the trolley was in existence in Torrington from 1897 to 1929. I had to include this photo of South Main Street, even though it's blurry, because it gives you a wonderful idea of the buildings that stood along South Main Street. This woman standing in Co Park, and behind her are a number of structures, of course, which are all gone. And these included some very early buildings, including the brick building that you see on the far left, which was sadly, like the others, torn down. Throughout Torrington's history, you'll find many streets named after families, and Daycoten Place was an interesting example where it was named after two landowners in the area, William Dayton and Lyman Co. Lyman Co. being the man who owns the Co Brass Company, the lumber company, excuse me, the Co Brass Company. And so Daycoten Place was named by merging those two names, Dayton and Co. This is an interesting view of Wilson and Cook Streets, and this is taken from Litchfield Street. If you're on Litchfield Street looking toward Wilson, this is what you would see. In fact, the Fusnich House, which is the White House that is in the center of this photo, is on the corner of Wilson and Cook Streets. It still exists. Now, by the time of this 1850s photo, or excuse me, map, there were, as I say, many streets in the downtown area. Most of the streets were located within that area. And one such street is John Street, which appears on the left of this map. And John Street was named for John Hungerford, who was known as Mr. John, hence the name John Street. And John Hungerford was very active in the Co Brass Company, but many people in Torrington today are much more familiar with the name Charlotte Hungerford, and Charlotte was his wife. The hospital is named after Charlotte. Another man in the another prominent man in mid-19th century Torrington who has two streets connected with him was George Wadhams. And George Wadhams built this fabulous granite structure in downtown Torrington, which was unfortunately torn down in the 40s. And it was known as the Granite Block, but it also contained Wadhams Hall, which was the site of many social events. He also owned Wadhams Manufacturing Company, and that company began as a firm making brass buttons, but evolved into a firm that instead, by the mid-19th century, was manufacturing items of paper mache. And as you could see at the top of this map, the Wadhams Manufacturing Company buildings are situated along this road. This is now East Pearl Street. And by the way, George Street, nearby George Street, was also named after George Wadhams. But the paper mache items that were produced in the 1850s were a major product, obviously, for this company. And the story goes that the pieces of shells, the mother of pearl, so littered the grounds of the factory that they came to call the road Pearl Street. And that's how Pearl Street got its name. Another reference in a street name to a local industry is Pulver Street off of Midgeon Avenue. And Pulver Street was the site of the Pulver Carriage Company, a longtime business in Torrington. The business actually was started in the 1850s elsewhere in Torrington, and their structures are still standing. This is a great view showing Pulver Street in the foreground with the business right behind it, situated right behind the road. Now, one of the major roads that all of us who live in Torrington or know Torrington are familiar with is Midgeon Avenue. And as we can see, Midgeon Avenue follows along the, sorry, I keep hitting this very testy little mouse. Midgeon Avenue follows along the center of this slide, going north-south on this slide. And Midgeon Avenue is a main thoroughfare. And interestingly, it's probably one of the earliest references to an immigrant in Torrington history that appears on a street sign. This is Henri Midgeon. Henri Midgeon came to this country in the early 19th century, and he came with a letter of introduction from General Lafayette. He was a very prosperous man. He was quite a businessman, but he also became very successful, a self-made man. And he lived on the corner of Church and Midgeon Avenue. And it's said that Henri Midgeon used to plant trees along the street, and he also donated to many other causes. The children of Torrington loved him come July 4th because he would hand out firecrackers, and apparently on the centennial gave them coins instead. This is a picture of the Midgeon family. And another family member who lived on Midgeon Avenue was his son Achille, his wife Elizabeth, and their children. And Achille was very active in a number of local industries, including Excelsior Needle, Union Hardware, and Eagle Bicycle Company, all of which happened to be conveniently located near his home. Achille and Elizabeth built a grand home named Laurelhurst on Midgeon Avenue. It was on the corner of Midgeon Avenue and Forest Street. It actually still is there, but not in a very good state of repair or in need of repair. And Laurelhurst, as you can see from this slide, was a large property. It contained riding paths. There was a stream that went through it. There were specimen plantings. It was really, in its day, an incredible piece of property. And you can also see from the map that A.F. Midgen appears all around the property. He owns quite a bit of property along all around Field Street and Forest Street. And in fact, it was his wife Elizabeth who named Forest Street. And much like the name Laurelhurst, it became popular in the 19th century to name streets after trees and waterways and various natural elements. And this was brought about in part by the design and construction of places like Central Park and the Mount Auburn Cemetery, the rural cemetery movement. There was a newfound appreciation for nature, and this is reflected in many cases in streets throughout Torrington. Forest Street was one of them. Forest Street, by the way, was a street that Mrs. Midgen also contributed $4,000 toward the road improvements and the creation of sidewalks and also fencing. She also named Field Street, pictured in the distance. The Excelsior Needle Company buildings were pictured or are pictured on Field Street here. And in the foreground, we see Prescott Street with Pearl Street intersecting. Another road that was affected at the same time with a change in the name was what we now know as Lake Street off of Midgen Avenue, and that had previously been Ice House Road. And Ice House Road was located on the Cobras Dam. One of the residents of the town did not like the fact that his home was going to be situated on Ice House Road, and he thought that it was time for the name to be changed. And so he approached Lyman Co, and Lyman Co agreed to this name change, and it was changed to Lake Street. On the left side of this image, we see Riverside Avenue, and many of us know Riverside Avenue. Riverside Avenue was originally named West Side Avenue. It was laid out in 1887. And from the minute it was laid out, it was always being touted as this wonderful road to walk along. Obviously, it's very close to the river. But within a year of being laid out, it was decided to name it Riverside. Again, another reflection on that interest in naming streets after elements of nature, giving it a more appropriate name than something like West Side. So the street was renamed. On the south end of town, Park Avenue, you can find Park Avenue right off of Albert Street, East Albert Street in Torrington. And on this map, you'll see it, and it's showing Valley Park right near it. Well, Valley Park was the site of a very early horse park, a horse racing track, I should say. And it ran from South Main Street almost to the river. It was very large. It was, for a very short period of time, a very popular, track in Torrington. Henri Midgen contributed quite a bit of money for this track. And it was said to draw in thousands of people and brought a lot of people to Torrington. It was apparently quite beautiful in its day. Unfortunately, it was short-lived, and later on, the property was acquired and it was developed for housing instead, and that's where Park Avenue gets its name. And this is a view looking down Park Avenue in 1930. Oh, I apologize for this blurry slide. Albert Brooker is the man we see pictured here, and Albert Brooker was a Civil War veteran, came back from the Civil War, became very involved with the Co-Brass Company for a period of time, but more than anything, Albert Brooker was a large landowner in Torrington. And when Torrington was growing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he was very active building new properties, dividing lots and selling those lots. And he really had quite a real estate holding. Albert Street is pictured at the bottom of the street. It was named for Albert Brooker, and the Brooker home stood on the corner of Albert Street and Litchfield Streets. It's where Thompson Heights is today, the elderly housing complex. And this house was built in 1890. You can see it pictured here with Southwest School in the distance. And this view of Litchfield Street's interesting to see. Many of you may know the term Hospital Hill. I know I've heard it in my day. I've heard people refer to this section of Litchfield Street as Hospital Hill. And the reason for that, of course, was for the Charlotte Hungerford Hospital, which is pictured way up at the top of the hilltop in this image on the right. You can barely see it. 1887 brought electricity to downtown Torrington. And there was a brief period of time in April of that year where the electricity was not working. And I had to include this quote because it certainly makes us appreciate, I think, the electricity that arrived at that time. The village has been a far pleasanter place to live since the streets have been lighted. There has been much less insulting of women, and the old tricks of tripping up people at night by strings across the walk were stopped until the darkness reigned again this week. I'm just amazed that people were up to such shenanigans. And I bring up the electricity because it plays into our next story. East Branch Street is what we now know as Franklin Street. And East Branch Street was named for the East Branch of the river. And you can see from this map detail that there were athletic grounds on the street. There were also a number of homes and businesses situated there. And in addition, the Torrington Electric Light Company was located at the end of the street. The residents of East Branch Street were not happy in 1906 because there was a saloon with the same name that was had kind of a notorious reputation. And they didn't like the fact that their address, which held the name East Branch Street, might also reflect on that saloon and that people might be thinking of the saloon. So they petitioned the city to change the name of the street. And one of the suggestions was to name it after Benjamin Franklin and his experiments with electricity because of the Torrington Electric Light Company connection. And so it was renamed Franklin Street. And this is a view of the backside of Franklin Street in the 20s, showing the East Main Street buildings, the backside of those buildings right near the river. Around this time, we see numerous articles about the growth of Torrington appearing in the Hartford Courant, the Torrington Register, the 1900 Courant, after the census was done, noted that Torrington was the most rapidly growing town in the state, and it had more than doubled in population. And this 1907 article referenced the city of Torrington, or the town of Torrington as it was, no more rapidly growing town or city in the Naugatuck Valley, the metropolis of Litchfield County. Much of that growth was due to the industry, of course, and the jobs that the industries provided. And from the very beginning of the 19th century, people were coming to this country. Many immigrants were coming to this country and coming to Torrington, and they included English, German, Irish, Italians, Slovak, Poles coming to Torrington, Lebanese, So Torrington really developed a very rich ethnic diversity, and it's great to have that in this town. And of course, they were, as I say, coming for the jobs. It's Co Brass, Hendy Machine Company, the Warrenton Woolen Mill, you name it. So by the late 19th century, we begin to see a huge jump in the population, and that leads to much more development. And when you think about the infrastructure of a city, it's really kind of amazing when you see these numbers, that in 1880, there were about 3,000 people. 20 years later, it had more than, gone up to 12,453. And then by 1920, again, over 22,000 now. 1923, it was 23,000, and Torrington became a city at that point. And this really is a period of great growth on the west side. The newspaper accounts that you find, if you were to scour through those early 20th century newspapers, late 19th century newspapers, you'll find many, many advertisements for homes all over Torrington. But it's interesting to see the homes on the west side because they talk about being near Hendy's and Co Brass, 5 minutes walk from Hendy's. So they're obviously promoting the proximity to work for these people. Some developers took it one step further. We actually have in the collection this broadside, which is in Polish, and it's promoting housing on the west side of town between Highland Avenue and Hoffman Street. And you can see what the translation is saying: 7 minutes from the center, near all factories, unnecessary to carry your dinner. In other words, you could go home at lunchtime. You don't have to buy a car, on high ground. And so it's really interesting to see something that appears in the native tongue of some of these residents. And again, a blurry photo, but we don't have many photos that show the west side, and I had to include this picture of Funston Avenue. Many Torrington street names reflect the city's ethnic diversity. Summer Street was known as Dublin Hill in the 19th century because of the large number of Irish immigrants who lived in that area. And we also see Limerick Street, which was on North Elm, Pulaski, French. There are many, many names that appear. Volkman Lane is the road that it's an alley, I should say, that connects East Main Street and Franklin Street to Franklin Street. And Henry Volkman came here from Bavaria in the 19th century. And he worked first in factories and as a barber before establishing the Germania Hotel, which is this beautiful building. If I can get this arrow to, here we go, there we go. This is the Germania Hotel as it looked at the time. It's now Bocce's restaurant, but the Volkman family also lived nearby, and Volkman Lane was the name given to what had previously been Kennedy Lane. This is the inside of the Germania Hotel. This section off of Midgeon Avenue, it's identified on this map as North Elm. And you can see this section of Millard, Miller, Goodwin, Butler, Union. This had been a hunting ground in the 19th century, if we can imagine that today. And in the 1890s, two employees of the Union Hardware Company decided to develop this area, what we now know as Pulaski Street, but what had been Union Street, and they named it after the company, after the firm. Union Street became home to St. Mary Polish Catholic Church. And in the 1930s, some of the residents of Union Street, who were obviously Polish residents and residents or attended the church. They petitioned the city to change the name to Pulaski Street after Casimir Pulaski, a Polish nobleman and hero of the Revolutionary War. And it looked like this was going to go through easily and be approved. But then some other residents objected to this, and this went back and forth for a few years before finally being settled in 1935. And at that time, the name Pulaski was approved. Another area of Torrington that had a reference to Irish immigrants was what was known as Limerick Street. And this is in the background, you'd see an early view of North Elm Street. And a section of North Elm Street was known as Limerick Street and actually appears in a list of streets in the 1880s. So it was a very early street name in Torrington. By the way, this is North Elm Street and Main Street intersection today. Or not today, excuse me. Winsky's Diner was there. At the top of this map, you'll find, I had to include, since we're talking about North Elm Street, you'll find North Elm Street here. And North Elm Street and Midgeon Avenue, that road was really an interesting road that had several names. The area closest to the Goshen Road was called West Torrington Road. And then it was North Elm Street as pictured on this map. At one point, there was a section of Midgeon Avenue, and that all changed through the years. And so now it's North Elm Street until the Midgeon Avenue intersection, and then it becomes Midgeon Avenue, as we know. West Torrington Road is long gone. So this would have been a section of West Torrington Road. If you're coming down the Goshen Road and crossing the road into Torrington, this would be West Torrington, image you'd see in the 1890s. Developers in Torrington continued to use many names to shape the image of a development. This is something they become very conscious of, very conscientious about what those names might, how those names may affect the development, I should say. And so there are many references to trees and brooks and brookside, and of course they're tacking on wood and view to many street names, but we also see the use of university and college names, streets that are named after states, and of course family names, which have been used throughout history and continue to be used. Torrington has 12 streets named after presidents, one of which, Washington Avenue, was actually named very early on in 1889 on the anniversary of Washington's inauguration. And then there are streets named after Revolutionary War battles, as well as streets named after leaders of the Spanish-American War. And one of those leaders was George Dewey. And Dewey became very popular in the United States after his victory at the Battle of Manila Bay. And across the country, parks and streets were named after him, and Torrington would do the same. Interestingly, this statuette of Dewey was produced by the Miller Manufacturing Company of Torrington. Again, that's how popular he was. And so in Torrington, if you look at these two maps, you could see the map on the left has this quirky street, Labyrinth Street, which goes near the river, and it goes down and across to Midgeon. And the town wanted to build a bridge across the street across the stream. And they were deciding as to whether or not they should go across Cherry or across Labyrinth. It was decided that since Labyrinth was a smaller part of the river, they would put a new road in across that way. And so the Wolcott Avenue Bridge that we all know today, Wolcott Avenue goes right over the river as you see in this map on the right. Torrington was really beginning to expand, and one of the areas it was going was northward. So out from the center, we would see more housing going out that way. And part of the attraction, of course, is that the trolley went that way as well. So you didn't need a car if you wanted to live out that way. It was certainly possible to get to and from the center or work and use the trolley for transportation. This view is interesting because in the foreground you see Center Cemetery in the lower right, and you can see Sacred Heart Church in the distance, a very distinctive building. The Willard Service Station, I just had to include this photo, is this was situated on Main Street, North Main Street, about across from present day CVS, Torrington Savings Bank, the North Branch. And you can see in the foreground of this photo, you can see the trolley tracks. Here's the trolley on the last day of its run. St. Mary's Church in the distance. This is at the intersection of North Elm and Main. And of course, people were going outward because there were job opportunities farther out. Warrenton Woolen Mill was now located in the North End, Fitzgerald Manufacturing, Torrington Lumber Company. So there were industries out that way as well. And what we continue to see are more and more houses and streets being developed. Prospect Park is this area on the lower part of the map, Marjorie Street, Lois Street, Benham, Lorenzo, not Calhoun, Alice. And Prospect Park was developed by a firm out of Boston. One of the members of the firm was, one of the partners in the firm was Lorenzo. He was married to a woman whose maiden name was Benham, and the other streets, Marjorie, Lois, and Alice, were named after other female family members. This is the intersection of Lois and Main. Those two buildings are still there. Northside Park was farther afield on North Main Street, off of the North Main Street area. And they were touting in this ad the trolley, because the trolley line was there, so that made it convenient, but also that it was away from the smoke and the dirt from the factories in the center. There was a planned golf course for this area that was never built. But it was an area that that included quite a few single-family homes, and it would become very popular. So we can see how Torrington is growing and expanding, and this continued for a few more decades. 1938 photo of the downtown shows you a bustling center, which Torrington would remain for quite some time and still is. In the distance is the Farnham House Central Hotel, which was torn down after the flood. And I had to include this photo too. This is kind of interesting to see with all the buildings that we all know. Expansion was starting to go out to the east more so than it had been, and all along East Main Street and streets off of there, we begin to see new pockets of development. Former farmland like Grandview Farm, Doolittle Farm, those areas little by little were developed. And this 1961 image shows you East Main Street looking toward the center. And certainly the automobile allowed people to go farther afield. They didn't have to work in Torrington anymore. And the other thing that was happening was that there were some industries that had closed. I mean, Hendy's closed by 1961 by the time of this photo. And so there was definitely a loss of jobs. And that was prompting people to work outside of town if they had to. And there were two other major projects in the 20th century that impacted the city, and also the loss of streets and homes. One was the South Central Redevelopment Project. And if you look at this photo, you can see that across from Co Park, let's see if I can, this area here, this entire area of homes and businesses was eliminated to make way for a shopping plaza. And this was part of the South Central Redevelopment Project after the flood. So you can see homes like this were just taken, basically. And in its place, we got a shopping plaza. So that was a real loss. And if you ever talk to anyone who lived in that neighborhood, they will certainly tell you that it was a loss of an entire neighborhood, and many homes and streets were eliminated at that point too. And Route 8 was even more disastrous in a sense, because Route 8 was convenient. It certainly is convenient to have the highway, but it also eliminated, once again, many streets and homes. And I brought up the Rosenbeck House, or Rosenbeck Castle as it was known, as an example of that. And this home was located on Rosenbeck Hill near Rock Street. Rosenbeck Hill was off of Hill Street that you see here. You can see this, this Rosenbeck Hill, and then Rock Street and Rosen Avenue. Incidentally, Rock Street was named for the Rosenbeck family, the first two and the last two letters in the name, and Rosen is also the first half of their name. So that house and Rock Street were eliminated to make way for Route 8. And that's just one example of dozens and dozens of streets and houses that were eliminated for this project in the 60s. We also saw several streets being renamed, and one such street was Town Farm Road, which was renamed University Drive in 1962 when the Yukon branch was put there, or was started. And this bucolic scene, unfortunately, was eliminated when the not eliminated when the university came in, but the town farm would be eliminated. That building would be eliminated. And what happened in this case was that the Brooker home, you remember the Brooker home at the corner of Albert and Litchfield Streets? The Brooker home was part of an estate left to the state of Connecticut by Julia Brooker Thompson, whose wish was that Yukon establish a branch in Torrington for the children of factory workers, as she had stated. And so this property was swapped to create the Yukon branch. And what happened was this property was about 1.5 acres. It wasn't large enough for the Yukon branch. The city took the town farm property and allowed that to be used for the Yukon branch. The town farm building was burned, and the University of Connecticut was then constructed and dedicated in 1965. And Town Farm Road was renamed University Drive, and this was subject to approval from the residents on that road. As many of you know, the University of Connecticut Torrington branch no longer exists, but fortunately 5 Points Center for the Visual Arts is now located in that spot. Now, there were many other roads that were renamed, and part of this happened in the 1950s in an ordinance that the city put together that officially renamed dozens of roads in the town. And one such section of East Main Street was officially renamed. This section that looks toward Torringford, and this is a view from about 1920, and what a scene this is. This looks quite different today. But this section, you would find Moscarillos on the lower right part of your screen here. And this was known as Torringford Avenue until you got to Torringford Street. So this was officially renamed East Main Street. There were other names that were changed, and they included Pig Farm Road, which became part of Peck Road, Soapstone Hill Road, which became part of Highland Avenue and is a reference to the soapstone quarry that was worked for hundreds of years in Torrington. Hospital Hill, a section of Litchfield Street, Craig Street, which had been, or Oliver Street had been Craig Street until the Oliver Wolcott School came into Torrington, and then the street was renamed Oliver Street. And the Old North Road, which followed Albert Park Road through Albert Park to meet up with the Winston Road. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Good job.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Gail. Very interesting.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.